It's a really interesting treatise. It's from 1527. So, you know, a couple of years after the Peasants' Wars and things are going on. And it comes right during a time when the plague was ravaging Wittenberg and other parts of Germany. I'd like to give a little background to what the plague was, then talk about Luther's treatise, and then I'll open up to questions, but I'm really open to, if you have any questions along the way, don't hesitate to stop me. And when Pastor Eric asked me about doing this, I happened to be talking with Bob Schultz, and he said, well, what does Luther think about the plague? And I said, well, there's this great treatise. And he said, you should talk about that sometime. And then after that, he says, by the way, I want to ask you a bunch of questions about Luther. And so that's how the next week's session came about. I'm going to start next week's session based on a question by Bob Schultz, which was about what was Luther's attitude towards the Jews. He wanted to know more about that. And so as we talk about positive things that Luther did, we can also talk about negative things as well. And so we'll talk a little bit about that next week, the dark side of Luther. But I'll try to leave next week kind of open, rambling, like Pastor Eric said, and we'll kind of go what your interests are in with Luther. So it was July of 1527. Luther was in a Great Depression. Those of us that study Luther and know a lot about him, like Pastor Eric and I, know that one of the things that's rarely talked about publicly, or very much even in his biographies, is that Luther was regularly quite depressed. Steve probably knows this as well. But he had this regular sort of depression, and Luther was in a Great Depression in 1527, in part because he'd been very ill. Luther had very ill health throughout much of his life. Despite that, he lived to be a fairly ripe age for that time period. And so he was rather depressed, and a pastor had written him, Wittenberg had been struck by the plague. It was causing a great deal of trouble. And Luther had taken him a great deal of time to write him back just because he was too depressed to write. If you watch the movie Luther with Joseph Fiennes as Luther in it, there's a scene where he and Catherine are talking, and Catherine says to him, you know, something like, you know, you're really doing a great job. And he says, Catherine, half the time I can't even get out of bed in the morning. It's a little over an exaggeration, but it's not too far. I mean, Luther did have these depressions and struggles. So one of the things I think it's important to remember right away is that the treatise is written as Luther is kind of struggling personally as an individual. And I think there's two things that are come through in the treatise. One is that there's this sort of wonderful practical advice that Luther gives. And then there's also this kind of idea that Luther always has, is like, well, let's have a little dialogue, you know, let's talk about this. This is what I think we should do with the plague. What do you all think? Some of his recommendations are going to be pretty shocking. But let me go back for a minute and just kind of talk about, given this sort of unprecedented events that we're going through with the coronavirus and the pandemic, you know, we have been extremely fortunate in our culture. I think we had gotten rather complacent, realizing that it was about 100 years ago that we had a big pandemic in the United States as well. And I was delighted by this story in the newspaper about this woman who, as a young girl, got the plague and survived the pandemic and survived, and then recently, in her elderly years, also got it and survived again. So she survived both pandemics, which is rather astonishing, especially the recent one. But if we go back and look back at the 14th century, especially, there were always pandemics, there were always plagues that struck societies. And I think we got complacent when we realized that we had modern medicine, and we kind of thought, oh, we're kind of going to be immune to this. This is not going to happen to us. But there's always been a task force that is that has been worried about these things. So the year was 1347. And I'm going to read an eyewitness account. This is from Sicily, about what happened in Sicily in 1347. It happened in the month of this October, in the year of our Lord, 1347, that 12 Genoese galleys, galleys from boats from Genoa, made port in Sicily. They were fleeing the wrath of our Lord that had come down upon so many from where they had been. It was in the city of Messina in Sicily. They brought with them a plague that they carried from the very marrow that they were carrying in the very marrow of their bones. So that if anyone so much as spoke to them, they would be infected with this mortal illness, which brought almost immediate death with great pain and toil. Now, what do we know about the plague? Well, we know that historians of medicine realized that the plague had been raging in China for about 5 years before this. And eventually what happened is that there's two strains of the plague. The first strain that was brought to Europe came on rats, and a particular strain of rats, and the black rats that came on the boats and then jumped ashore. And then the fleas on those rats that came off the rats went on to people. And when those fleas bit people, they got the disease. They became infectious to others. So the first part is this question of cleanliness and the black fleas, the fleas from the black rats. And then also that there seems to have been a pneumatic version of this plague, that if you came in contact with somebody who had this plague, that you would get it. I'm going to share my screen a little bit to show you oops, I need to go to the slideshow. So you can see this first slide here with Luther. He didn't use masks in the Middle Ages. You can see at this point, this is a medieval illustration of the plague that it got people. One of the things that's kind of missing in this illustration is that when the plague struck people, it basically went to their glands, especially their lymph glands, their groins, and you could see it also caused pustules on the body, most of which is hard to see here, were black and blue, and that's why the plague got the name Black Plague. And so you can see that it was quite devastating. And what we know of the Black Plague is that it killed up to half the people who got it. So the death rate of the people who contracted the disease was 50%. The coronavirus, by contrast, is around 4%. I see Mike just joined us a little bit ago. Thank you, Mike, for that wonderful article in the paper this morning about coronavirus. So there's a Sicilian chronicler by the name of Depazia, and he writes this. He says, "There are no words to describe how horrible these events are. Whoever can say that they have not lived in utter horrid conditions can truly consider themselves lucky. The infected die almost immediately. They swell up in their armpits and their groins and fall over while talking. Fathers abandon their sons, wives abandon their husbands, and one brother abandons another. And in the end, everyone escapes and abandons anyone so that they will not be affected. It is such a horrible disease, not just because of what it does to the body, but what it does to the soul. I myself have buried 5 of my own sons with my own hands." Wow. A remarkable death rate. And when the plague was done, by 1350, we see within 3 years, the plague will have spread from Sicily all the way into northern Sweden and Norway. It waved across Europe like a giant tsunami and left a third of Europe. And I usually tell my students, you know, think of a third of Europe. All of us have families, parents, just us and our parents, one of us would have died. Everybody was touched by this remarkable disease. I don't know about you. I'm going to try to make some contrasts to the modern day, but it seems like in the last week, I've heard from close friends in the Fargo area that a number of close friends have contracted the illness. And one of them I know, who is my age, wound up in the hospital very seriously ill. As the disease goes on, we'll have more and more people that we know. Some people we're just talking about, some people we know that have actually died of the disease. I've had a few friends die across the country that I've known that have died of this illness as well. Well, the Black Plague was pretty astonishing, and it was very devastating. So, well, that's the context of this plague that Luther is talking about. And the response that people had to the plague in the Middle Ages, I'm going to go back and share my screen, is that some of these responses were pretty fanatical. This is a medieval image of what a group of people called the flagellants. These are people who went, you can see the man in the middle, he's actually holding a whip. They're all holding whips. Can you see it? And they have little barbs on the end of those whips, and they're striking themselves and whipping themselves. And they felt that the plague must be a punishment sent from God because there was something wrong with the people in Europe, and they needed to get right with God. So you can see the person in front, they're carrying banners, and right behind him is carrying a cross, and they're doing penance for all of Europe. And these people whipped themselves in hope that God would turn from God's anger, and therefore the disease would be abated. Of course, you know, if we think we're modern, we think these people are foolish, all you have to do is read a newspaper article in the Forum a couple days ago that says God is not happy with America, calling all of America to repent. And so we're not really that far removed. There are still people who think, although this, instead of Black Plague, it says God is not happy with America. If you don't think that the COVID-19 wildfires and earthquakes and hurricanes are a wake-up call from God, you are fooling yourselves. Well, one of the things that we can talk about or suggest is that at every day and every age, there's ways of interpreting these diseases. And one of the problems that Luther had, and one of the questions that he was concerned about, was how should we think about this disease? During the time of the Black Plague, art changed dramatically. This is an image from the time of the Black Plague, and it's called The Dance of Death. And one of the things that this story is meant to tell people in the Middle Ages was that, so there's two stories. One is these three men are riding on horses, and they come upon these other three people riding, these three skeletons riding a horse, and they start having a conversation with the skeletons who talk with them. And it becomes clear that by the end of the conversation that these skeletons are actually them in the future. And this picture depicts the people dancing with themselves in the future, saying, this is what you're going to look like. Wow. Not a very cheery picture, right? Well, this is the context in which Luther finds himself. This is how he understands himself. And this whole notion of a dance of death and how the plague is affecting Luther's day is really the context that now I finally get to talk about a little bit about what Luther's ideas are. So a man by the name of Reverend Johann Hess writes Luther, and he says, can we run away from the plague? Is it appropriate to run away from the plague? In other words, should we protect ourselves? How do we protect ourselves? Shouldn't we protect ourselves, says the pastor, but how do we treat those that have the plague and when we put ourselves at risk? So Luther starts out, first of all, apologizing because it took so long to write him. And then he starts out and says, well, you know, let's talk about this. And if you want to debate, we can. But the first thing he wanted to admit is, first of all, he says right out of the chute, he says, I think God loves all people. I think as soon as we move to an argument where God loves some people and not others, and God gives the plague to some people, that makes our God a pretty strange and hateful God. So I don't want to go there. Well, your question, he says, then next is really about the question of how we should respond. And so let me focus on that, he said. So he dismisses this idea of, these ideas of God's punishing people with diseases this way. He just sees the world as being, he thinks that the diseases are evil. Evil comes about in the world because of human sin. And so therefore, there's a sense in which if you want to blame anybody, you have to blame ourselves for the disease. So he says there's two types of people. First of all, there's faithful people, and then what he will call the strong people, and then he'll say, and there are weak people. And and his first comment is, God loves both. And so what's a faithful person? He says, Luther says, a faithful person is a person who knows that the plague is a horrible evil in the world, and that what they want to do is a strong person goes to the people that are in need, despite the fact it creates risk for themselves. God certainly loves these people and is thankful for them. And Luther would point out that these are like our medical professionals, people who in our day and age go out and day in and day out put their lives at risk for these people. And these are people he calls strong. And then he says there are, by the way, he would put pastors in this category as well, or people who go out. See, Luther thinks that there's two sorts of categories that you have to take care of during a time of plague. You have to take care of a person's bodily needs and give them whatever medicine and help they need, food, comfort, and strength. But they also have spiritual needs, and pastors need to go into those places where people need spiritual need, because people become depressed like Luther did during the time of Wittenberg. And he found great solace in his comfort from other friends who came to him, especially other pastors who gave him solace. Then Luther says, then there's the weak, those who believe that it's okay to do as they please and they may run away. Luther doesn't really blame them. He says, you know, it's interesting. These weak people are worried about self-preservation. And he says, I kind of get that. He says, God loves these people too. They run away in weakness. Is that sinful? It can be at times, he says. Yeah, it can be sinful, but he says, I don't really blame them. We in the church are about caring for the weak. And so we should be compassionate to them. So now he goes, okay, that's kind of the big categories. Let me think about this a little bit more carefully. So first of all, one principle, God doesn't want the sick to be abandoned. And he quotes a number of Bible verses on this. And so running away from the plague was something that was very common. We see this. If you want to see a wonderful film, if you can watch it in Swedish and read subtitles, The Seventh Seal by Ingmar Bergman, the great director, is about Sweden and a night and with a group of people who are trying to actually flee the plague. They're running away from the plague. Amazing film. And it gets into a lot of these sorts of religious questions as well. So God doesn't want people to be abandoned. And he does think that sometimes people run away from the plague out of disobedience to God, because they do know that their responsibility is to take care of the poor and the sick and the hungry. And sometimes they run away from that from their own needs. So who are the people in a community that what are their responsibilities? And he said, first of all, we have spiritual leaders, our pastors, who are about the care of our souls. That's a medieval phrase. The care of our souls is what it was believed that what pastors give is the care of our souls. So Pastor Eric, Pastor Brian, and others who are involved in ministry in our church, and all of us who are considered priests in Luther's eyes as the priesthood of all believers, our main responsibility is to give to care of people's souls. And that means we must be willing to die for others if necessary. In other words, sometimes we even have to put ourselves at risk in times of coronavirus to do the thing that God wants us to do. It's terrible, but when we do it, God gives us the strength to do it, says Luther. The other people are public officials, people who care for the bodies. Notice care of bodies versus care of souls. And in this, Luther puts both public officials like mayors and city officials who have the responsibility to take care of those in their cities who are sick and ill, and must do what is required, but also he lumps into this category doctors and nurses. And that means that, well, doctors and nurses are obvious for Luther. They have to go and take care of the needy and the sick. And I'm going to share with you what a doctor might have looked at like when they went to see the needy and the sick. This is another picture of the plague. You can see in the background kind of a sea of dead people, skeletons kind of waving onto living people. It's like a gigantic battle. It's a war between life and death. And if you look at some of the other images of the dogs and the horses, this is a plague that's destroying all people in this society. By the way, you can find this treatise online. It's available free, but if you look in Luther's works, you can find it there. I also would like to recommend a wonderful book. The first thing I really read in any depth was A Distant Mirror by Barbara Tuchman, who she's a wonderful writer. If you want to learn about this terrible time and read some difficult stuff, this is a good book to read, called A Distant Mirror. And notice her image is that the 14th century is a mirror of our time. And I think one of the things I want to talk about with Luther, thinking about the sort of care that needs to be given here, this is one of the things Luther says is the people who have a big responsibility are those who bury those that are sick and ill, and notice that they're taking a great deal of risk in burying the sick outside of cities. But here's a medieval doctor's mask. If you were going into if you were going into a house that was full of plague, the one on the left with kind of the, looks like a big bird and very leather, is a very expensive mask that a doctor would have worn. The one on the right is, if you went to the Minneapolis Art Institute exhibit of Luther, you would have seen this mask. This was in that exhibit. Now, why do they have those big noses? They would stuff those noses full of certain herbs, and especially a thing called thieves oil mixture. And some of you, Peggy has this thieves oils mixture that she uses an oil and an ointment. It's like clove and lemon and cinnamon and eucalyptus and rosemary and these sorts of things. By the way, sorts of herbs that have very high antiseptic qualities to them. And oddly enough, this mask worked. It's not quite like our masks, but this baby really works. I mean, you know, now thieves would put these, it's called thieves oil because they would put these combinations of these various ingredients in bags around their necks while they went to the tombs and robbed the dead people of plagues that had died in the plague. So that's why they call it thieves oil. Or might break into people's houses who were dying and steal their things. But this did offer some, oddly enough, some protection to thieves and others. So notice that they're wearing masks. Doctors are supposed to take care of themselves, and depending on how much wealth they had, they could have really good masks or really bad masks, or pretty, you know, they were tempted to do that. So Luther says a spiritual leader can't give up the care of the souls. A public official and doctors can't give up the care of the bodies. And then we have families. And the question is, are families responsible for family members? Absolutely, says Luther. Anyone who does not provide for their own family is worse than an unbeliever, says Luther, quoting 1 Timothy chapter 5. However, family members need to provide for their family members. So now the question, so notice what Luther's done so far. He says, who are the people that have obligations in a society? And these are not only, so spiritual leaders, public leader, officials, doctors, families. And then he goes one more category. He says, there are people, if you have a job and you own a business, an employer has a responsibility to their employees, and the employee has a responsibility to their employer as well. So you cannot flee, says Luther, from the plague if you have a responsibility to even one person. If there's somebody in your community, a family member, an employer or employee, or they're under your spiritual care or under your public official care or doctor, you may not flee the plague. That would make it a sin. Now that pretty much covers everybody, right? But Luther does think that there's a possibility. Say, for example, we have three pastors in our church, Pastor Eric, Pastor Brian, and let's say an elderly pastor who helps out with the church. It might be, says Luther, that elderly pastor should probably flee the plague, because we have two pastors who can take care of the spiritual needs, and this pastor is more at risk than the others. That would be okay. That pastor should flee. That's an interesting argument, right? He says if the needs are met in a spiritual way, this pastor can leave. Now, if that pastor has other responsibilities, say in family and things, then that creates more of a complication. Then Luther uses two really interesting illustrations to make his point. The first one is this. He says, let's imagine that there's a house on fire. Let's imagine your house is on fire and you're outside and you're looking into the house. The question is who should run into the house to save the people that are dying in there? Well, you shouldn't send in anybody who doesn't know what they're doing, because they might die in the process. You can't be foolish, says Luther, right? So we send in firemen, the people that are prepared to take care of the thing that's inside. And notice now how his illustration works. His idea is if Well, if we're in a society and you're going to go in and try to treat somebody that has the plague, that might be kind of foolish. We should let doctors and nurses handle that, right? Now, you should give care as you can, but you should wear masks. You should take care of yourself. You should do the right thing. Another illustration Luther gives is, what about a drowning person? Let's say you're standing at a lake and a person's out there drowning. Who should jump into the lake to help them? Well, it's somebody, a lifeguard, somebody who knows what they're doing, how to bring that person out of the water safely so that they don't drown themselves. Interesting, right? And then you use the illustration and say, well, so a child with a parent, you know, they should jump into the water and take care of that parent because other people can't do that, right? You have to do what you're capable of, but you shouldn't put yourself at risk at the same time. So then Luther goes on and says, well, who shouldn't flee the plague? Well, certainly pastors, if you're needed in a church, you know, it would, Luther actually says, it would be, you would give up your responsibility and become evil. And then same with all the other people that he talked about in responsibility. But then Luther, whoa, my goodness, you know, he wondering about burials, he says, well, we have to practice, we should follow doctors' advice. When doctors tell us what we should do, and remember, they have no idea. It's not until the early 20th century that we have some of the advances that we have that we know what exactly the Black Plague is. Black Plague doesn't affect us anymore because penicillin, which was invented in 1923 by Alexander Fleming, who was a Scottish doctor, and it was completely by accident. He had two petri dishes next to each other. And one of the petri dishes, when he noticed these two petri dishes were next to each other, he realized that this one virus that was a pandemic virus that he was growing in a petri dish, it died. And so he looked at the next dish over and he found out he got mold in it. And he didn't know where the mold had come from. And so he started perpetuating the mold and found out, oh my God, it's penicillin. So then that's how penicillin came about, a complete accident. So what was happening then is Luther suggests, well, we need to follow doctors' advice. They know what they're doing. And so they wear these big masks with all these herbs and things in there, and they're being preserved. Okay, let's follow their advice, and we should bury people outside the cities, not inside the cities, because that perpetuates the plague. But wow, I want to read to you what Luther thinks about what should we do with people who are irresponsible with the plague. And he says, well, for example, what do we do with somebody who knows that they have the plague, but they just go around visiting other people anyway, putting them at risk, not listening to their doctors? All right, this is where Luther gets kind of rough. First of all, let me read this line. Anyone who does not do what they need to for their neighbor and forsakes their neighbor and flees when their neighbor needs them is nothing less than a murderer in God's sight. For they are nothing more than dogs or pigs. Luther never minced words. Then he quotes Matthew 25. I was sick and you did not visit me. That's our responsibilities as Christians. But what do we do with people who spread the disease knowingly? Luther says, whoever, well, let's see, that's not quite it. I need the other quote here. Oh, here we go. Luther says, and it is true that some people keep the disease secret, and they go about amongst others, contaminating and poisoning them. This is nothing less than the devil's doing. To be honest, sometimes I think we Germans are nothing better than devils instead of human beings when we do such things. It must be admitted that there are some extremely coarse and wicked people in our societies. The devil is never idle. My advice is that if any such persons are discovered, the judge should take them by the ear and turn them over to Master Jack, the hangman, and outright and deliberately consider them as murderers. For what else are they but assassins who walk into our town and kill the people of our neighborhoods? Here and there, an assassin walking amongst people, spreading the disease as if they are jabbing a knife through someone, and no one can quite figure out who the assassin is. So these folks infect a child here, a woman there, and can never be caught. They go on laughing as though they have accomplished something. Where this is the case, it would be better to live amongst wild animals than such murderers. I do not know how to preach to such killers. They pay no heed. I appeal to the authorities to take charge and turn them over, not to physicians, but to Master Jack, the hangman. Oh my goodness. Luther, sometimes I just don't know what to say. Well, so let's finish up with Luther, and then we'll open it up for some questions. Luther says, when we have a responsibility to at least one human, therefore, and we flee, this is evil. But we should notice that if we have a responsibility to one person and we help them, we should see and feel the joy that comes from such responsibilities. On the one hand, we sin by having fear and fright and not taking care of our neighbors in the way that we are called to do so. But on the right hand, there is the other side of where some people disdain our medications. People disdain medications, are reckless and stupid, going out amongst others when they have a disease, causing illness amongst them. However, says Luther, I would not blame anyone who flees in weakness if they have no responsibilities to anyone and may take care of themselves. And if somebody flees and is a terrible, wicked, evil person, and what is our responsibility? We should still be Christ to them and love them. The pastor's responsibility is to be a pastor to all, not just to some. And then Luther uses a very interesting illustration. If we see Christ or the Blessed Virgin Mary sitting on the side of the road in need, would we not give them drink and food and clothing and give and administer to them anything that we needed? Then why do we not do this to our neighbor who is Christ, as the scripture teaches us? So let us not tempt God, because the Christian responsibility in all truth is that we ourselves must be ready for death. This is our responsibility, to be ready, to be as the pastor or the doctor who go to the sick and do not hide themselves from their neighbor, but go to them in their time of greatest need. If we would die in the process, then we must say, thanks be to God. Now, pretty astonishing sort of evidence that Luther gives. Well, I've been talking for a while. I have one more point I can make, but maybe I'll make that at the end. Why don't I stop for a minute and see if anybody has any thoughts or observations? I have avoided making some obvious comparisons to our modern world. Maybe you noticed those, but anyway, anybody have any thoughts?
Yep, just a quick heads up. I muted everybody, or pretty much everybody, so you have to unmute yourself before you start talking. Just wanted to make sure everyone knew that.
Okay, thanks. Anybody have any comments or thoughts about Luther?
Well, now I see how to do it.
So when you were talking about Master Jack, what came to my mind was that quote, "Desperate times call for desperate measures." And it seems like the Master Jack is a desperate measure.
I think Luther, is Luther being serious? I honestly think he is. It's hard to imagine. I don't think we want to go that route, but there is, what Luther's point is that this is so serious that people won't really take it seriously. And sometimes these people are so cruel in their neglect of others, or especially if they neglect the disease in themselves and then give it to others. that he really wants, he uses a lot of hyperbole in his writings, and he goes way over the top to try to get people's attention. And Master Jack is definitely going over the top. Take him to the hangman, because these people are so bad in a society. So he's really calling city officials to take responsibility. City officials have a really important responsibility to protect the people in their charge. And this has been one of the big issues, right, in the United States. How much do political figures get involved to protect the people in our society? Luther would say their problem is if they don't do this, they're not following God's will. That would be his argument. That this is their God-given, since they're in this this is their responsibility. This is their God-given priestly job to do in a society. And if political officials do not protect people in their society, they've abdicated their responsibility and do not follow what God calls them to do.
Roy, you're acquainted with Word and World, the theological publication.
Mm-hmm.
Several months ago, there was an article, and I forget right now who authored this article, but he commented the year was 1527, and the elector had said it would be best if everyone would flee. And Luther got together with his own pastor, and they decided that the greater responsibility would be for them to remain and serve. And so they set up like a hospital in their own home.
Yeah,
Now,
this is true. Luther often did this. We have to remember that Luther's home was the Augustinian monastery, which he had learned how to be an Augustinian in, and so it was an actually gigantic abbey, and so there was entire wings and rooms that they could turn into hospitals. They could use it as a hospital ward, and Luther did that when in times of need. So fortunately, he had this gigantic house that he could do some of that in. Yeah, you're right. Well, and the dilemma is that it wasn't all dukes and lords. The dilemma is that this was hugely panicky, right? If 1 in 2 people who get this disease die, it was nearly a death sentence, right? I mean, the percentage of the people dying from this was rather high. Now, they were a lot smarter in the 16th century than they were in the 14th century, 200 years later. So the percentages of death were much lower at that time, because they knew to isolate themselves and to be careful. But they also knew that the other thing that comes up that Luther points out is that the poor are much more susceptible to these things than the rich. The poor can't really retreat into their castle and go into a certain wing and have servants bring them food, right? That's just not going to happen. So the rich had a way of dealing with this that the poor never had. And so whenever there was people in close proximity where they lived in poverty and they couldn't really isolate themselves, the death rate was much higher with them than it was with the wealthy who kind of fled. And so sometimes the lords in them would just hold up in their castles and kind of wait it out, no matter how many people were dying. And I think that's kind of what was going on in 1527. And Luther is really advocating that the public officials have to get out there. He's not advocating them being reckless or crazy, but he is advocating that they need to take care of the poor and provide the food and the things that they need and the public services that they need amidst this time. And that is interesting, the way that he points out the public officials, like employees, have to take care of their employer, and the employer has to take care of their employees.
Yes.
This is a big issue, right? Today, how do we deal with that?
Yeah.
Our son Josh, who just started a winery out in California and is going with this. I said, so how are you handling this? The shutdown. He says, I'm keeping he doesn't have many employees. He has a couple employees, but he said, I'm keeping them on the payroll. He says, well, hope we can weather the storm. But he says, I think it's the right thing to do. Well, that made me feel proud, but it's hard. A lot of employers can't do that, right? They can't afford to do that. So it's a very, very difficult position we're in right now.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did any of his family, Luther's family, directly within his family? Do you know?
Luther, as far as I know, he lost a daughter, a young daughter, not to the plague that I know, but she died of illness. And it was absolutely devastating on Luther. He went into a great deal of depression. He had 6 children of his own and adopted many more. Katerina, his wife, was in the habit of bringing people into the home. And so some people have joked that at one point, I believe they had 20 other kids living in their home. And so some people have joked that Luther was the father of the, Luther and Katerina were the father of Lutherans in more way than one, populating the Lutheran children. But yeah, so he really felt the agony. If you read his writings about his daughter's death, he was utterly devastated, completely depressed, and I think understood that particular aspect of what an illness can do to a society quite acutely. And that's why he felt it was so important for people in societies to think about who they were responsible for, especially within families. If you even have one person that you're responsible for, then you can't really retreat. Fleeing means not necessarily, going to Sweden or, the Mediterranean or something. It means kind of retreating into your own castle or going to a safe place where you can kind of ride out the illness till it's gone.
I have a comment about spreading the disease. I think there was in smallpox epidemics, sometimes it was knowingly spread among the Native American people. And that's
Native Americans have particularly suffered a great deal. Jeremiah, my oldest son, if you go online or if you write me, I can send you a link. He has been working a lot with CBS during this time. Normally, he's kind of doing his own social documentary sort of film, but in order to weather the coronavirus, he's been working with CBS, and they did a report on Native Americans in Arizona and the effect of coronavirus on Native Americans. It's absolutely devastating.
right.
And part of the reason is not only, this gets back to the whole question of the poor not having the same resources. There's some of it's just basic education and those sorts of things that they have. The story is about a half hour long, but it's pretty tragic what's happening on Native American reservations across the country right now with the coronavirus. And these are kind of the hidden sufferers in our society. Luther's question would be, who is responsible? Who needs to take care, who needs to be responsible there? And certainly a lot of officials in our country have absolved themselves of that responsibility of dealing with the poorest of our society. But you're right. It goes back to in the past. I mean, the destruction of Native Americans by literally spreading the disease amongst them deliberately. That's where Luther would say, "Bring out the hangman."
That's right. Yes, exactly.
Right.
Where's that Master Jack?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't advocate the death penalty. I'm completely against it, but but Luther's point is kind of hyperbole.
I just had a logistical question. So they talk about fleeing the plague, and you talked about the rich people could quarantine themselves in their castles, but what did they really mean, that people would physically leave a town and look for a safer town or go live in the country? Or how do you flee the plague?
Sometimes they could leave and go to another part of the country. If we remember how wealthy some of these lords are, they could go. I mean, the dukes sometimes had 5 or 6, 10 castles, whatever. And if there's a plague going on in, say, Wittenberg, they might go down to Leipzig and get away from it, so because the plague hasn't quite broken out there. And one of the things that's interesting is a lot of times if a plague broke out, say like in Wittenberg, and you're not far away in Erfurt might shut their doors and say, hey, if you're from Wittenberg, I'm sorry, you're not coming in here, you know?
Yeah,
So
just like right now, there's not many places Americans can flee to outside of the country.
yeah, it's so interesting. Early on, when the plague broke out in Washington State, which is my home state where I grew up, and it slowly started spreading then into California and other places, we felt pretty smug in North Dakota, didn't we?
Yeah, right.
Remember, we kind of thought, oh, well, you know, it's not going to get us and those, you know, those poor people out there. And then, you know, over time, by not being careful, now now they're looking at us and going, oh boy, you know.
So if we refuse to help our desperately sick neighbor, is that an effect of fleeing the plague?
It would be if Luther would say, is there somebody who is really responsible for them, you know, like family members and things, then it's maybe not your responsibility, Luther would say. You know, you have to kind of weigh these things, and also you have to weigh kind of your own risk, right? You know, some of us, oddly enough, I'm in my 60s, right? You know, and I feel like I'm told I'm in a high risk group. You know, I used to have asthma, and I don't have it anymore, but nevertheless, you know, the question of, do I have compromised lungs or whatever? You know, Luther would say you have to take those sorts of things into account, but we can do other things that can help, right? Our neighbor, even if we're not necessarily going in and taking care of them, but we can try to find ways to make sure that healthcare gets to them and they're taken care of. You know, that we reach out to them. Sometimes that may feel a little foolish. My mother lives in California. She's a complete extrovert. This is killing her, just to be inside by herself and not talk to neighbors. Just that isolation of it is creating a great depression for her. I think she sometimes takes some risks with neighbors and things that, you know, I'm a little uncomfortable with, but at the same time, I kind of get the fact that she's having this sort of sense of depression herself and knows that she needs to reach out. And sometimes she's reaching out to neighbors that later on, you know, have COVID. Thank God that she hasn't got it. But, you know, she's a very compassionate person, wants to help people. And she's finding ways to do that through the phone and reaching out to them to find out that they're not alone, and providing certain types of care, spiritual care, in this case, the care of the souls, when she can't provide care for the bodies. But she does talk with her neighbors who are more capable, who take care of their, you know, can help them with their bodies and are less at risk. So, I mean, I think people have been incredibly creative in trying to find ways to meet the needs of people that they know that are ill or need help. And I think that's something that St. John has had to do, right? We've had to shift online for our worship. And sure, it's not the same, but I look forward to it every Sunday. And I'm just so thankful that we have our pastors and our community that I'm there virtually with. It means a great deal to me. Oddly enough, for me, I've been going on with a lot of my old students who are now pastors across the country. And I go out and see the work that they're doing, and I go online and I'm connected to them in a way I haven't been in the past. And it's been really nice kind of connecting to them. So.
Roy, this is Jim calling. We have a question here. We were standing outside talking to someone over in the next yard the other day, and we talked about a number of other things. And then at the end, I mentioned that, you know, this is a difficult time we're in with the pandemic. And his response was, he said, in my view, this is all these precautions and everything are a lot of hogwash, and our view of the danger of it, other than just normal care, is just really a lot of falderall. And after he said that for a bit, why, I said, well, I happen to have an exactly opposite point of view than you do on the pandemic. And then he said, well, I have some appointments now and I have to go. And so he left. And we wondered what would be the response, or where would Luther put a person like this in his panoply of people that respond to the plague?
I think Luther's first distinction, and I've read this treatise a number of times, and I'm always puzzled by why he starts here. He starts at this distinction between the strong and the weak. It's a very simple distinction, right? And
Mhm.
Luther then goes to the next point and says, well, the strong are the people who take care of people, the weak are the ones that flees, but also the weak are some, who just go around and randomly spread the disease to others. Luther's response always, when you ask the question, what is our responsibility to the weak? And it's always that we must love them.
Mhm.
We must care for them. Now we have to do what we know is right for ourselves and for others, and that means that we need to mask. We need to take all these sorts of precautions. We can't throw those sorts of things to the wind, but we have to, at the same time, acknowledge that weakness is a part of the human condition, and God shows no favor between the weak and the strong, and it lets the rain fall upon all of us. And so we have to do the same thing. We have to find ways of being compassionate. You will never probably win somebody over like that by argument.
Oh.
You may win them over by example, and by being compassionate to them, and by holding to your principles and your ideas and your values, and remind them that you're wearing the mask to protect them, and you care for them and love them. I think that's what Luther's response would be. It's a very interesting, in a way, it's interesting that it comes back to that. I think if push comes to shove, even though we can acknowledge that we might say that person is weak in the way they're dealing with this or handling it, God still calls us to love them whatever way we can, through whatever actions we can do. But I think sometimes, the argument is just not going to win somebody over. I often tell my students, I say, in college, they're starting to figure out what their conscience is and what their views are on things. And I said, it seems to me that after 30 years of teaching, I've realized that it's not that arguments win out in the day. I think it's the other way around. We have a view, and then we go out and look for our arguments to justify our view. And so I think as a result, if that's true, you're never going to win over a person with argument, because they have these sorts of heartfelt convictions deep within them. So then the only way that you can win them over is by being compassionate.
Okay, thank you, Roy. That's helpful.
I think Martin Luther King Jr. is the most helpful here. Remember that sort of response that he gives. If you show us hatred, we will always respond with love, and we will change you from our enemy to our brother or our sister.
Mhm.
The enemy, you can never change the enemy's mind. You might be able to change their heart.
Mhm.
Good.
Okay.
Great.
Yeah.
One brave man, one brave man.
No,
Mark,
my mic is working.
Yes.
Roy, just a little bit of, first of all, thank you for such a timely piece. And it's kind of new to me. But a little bit of trivia, because we live in such a Norwegian area. And when I've shared this, it's kind of news to the people. So I thought I'd share it this morning. The last name Odegaard, I'm sure Pastor Eric knows this. In Norway, when the Black Death, the plague hit, virtually every area of Norway had farms that were desolate after the Black Plague, and there were not enough farmers left to farm all the farms. And so all of those desolate farms were called the Øde Gård, or the empty farms or deserted farms. And in fact, some of the valleys of Norway took 200 to 300 years to be repopulated. And so there would be a North Trandum, a South Trandum, an Odegaard Trandum farm. And people who then repopulated those empty farms took the name of the farm, which was Odegaard.
Well, you bring up a really interesting point. Scholars have noted that the Black Plague was so devastating by 1350, it had devastated the population of Europe so much that it would not return to the same level as it was in the 14th century until the late 16th and early 17th century.
Oh.
And what we see in one of my areas of interest as a scholar is medieval spirituality, and especially I'm quite interested in monastic communities, and like what Luther was an Augustinian, I'm especially interested in Augustinian communities. And one of the things that we see is if you look at the 14th century, one of my favorite writers, John Tauler, who was a very influential Augustinian author who Luther liked a lot, John Tauler died from the plague in around 1360. And one of the things that we see in these monasteries is that the monasteries had much higher death rates than anywhere else in the throughout Europe. And some people speculated early on that this was because they were living in close quarters and that, but that wasn't it, because they knew more about medicine and they were much more educated. It was their willingness to go out into the community and take care of the needy that led to their high death rates. And so sometimes 60, 70% in these monastic communities. And it's remarkable. I think Luther would admire that, you know. But you're exactly right, you know, that it took a really, really long time for these, you know, Odegard literally means, right, empty earth, right? Yes. You know, the earth became empty, you know. This was remarkably devastating. And for centuries and centuries. And it's hard to imagine what long-term effects coronavirus will have for us in the United States as well. Even though the percentage of people dying is much less, thankfully, due to our illnesses. Just as a side note, the only place the Black Plague really breaks out in the world today is in India now and then, and we send, you know, plane loads of penicillin, and it's usually, you know, the death rate is under 100 usually once it breaks out. And the other place is prairie dog villages.
Yeah.
They break, and the Black Plague comes out in prairie dogs. Yeah.
And Mongolia.
And Mongolia a little bit as well, right?
Because they eat the marmots that have the Black Plague.
Central Montana.
And there are also a few Black Plague victims in the US every year.
Say, in regard to what Steve just brought up about in Norway, because so many farms were not being farmed, producing food, was there a famine connected with the plague?
Yeah, it's interesting because your point is really well taken. One of the things that you'll notice in Europe in the 14th century was that after the plague happened in the 1380s, so this is about 30 years later, we have the great peasant revolts throughout Europe. And what happened is that because so many people had died, there was now a need to kind of lure workers to if you were a lord, to your lands, right? And so slowly people at this time, the serfs and people that have been basically economic slaves for generations and hundreds of years now are gaining some freedoms. And we see the early peasant revolts developing at this time because they now have some freedoms and they want more freedom at this time. And it's a really interesting problem that this is has huge economic effects across Europe as well. And also really leads to kind of the end of what we know as the serfdom in the Middle Ages. Was the Black Plague an interesting result of that as well.
Interesting.
So Roy, this is Mike, you'd mentioned that the Native American community has been hit hard with the coronavirus, and you're right. The US average is 31.6 new daily cases per 100,000. The Native Americans have 78.5. Wow. But North Dakota has 174.1, more than twice the Native Americans. And just to show just how bad it is here, and it doesn't have to be this way, we have, today we had 11 more deaths, and we've got, just in November, 78 people died. And for context, you know, you look at Vermont, they have 624,000 people, a little less population. They've lost one person since August 6th. They have a total of 59 deaths. We have a total of 639 deaths. And so we have the most deaths per capita, the most new daily cases per capita, and we have a governor that says it's not government's job to issue an emergency mask mandate, but it would be okay. And he believes masks work. but he thinks that the locals should do it. So, how do, because I've given this data out since about April and it's been climbing, but it doesn't, like you said, the facts don't seem to matter. So how do we get through to these guys?
It's Mike, you wrote a great article in the paper this morning. I appreciate it. I hope everybody reads it. Yeah, it's very, very difficult. I think Luther would try to probably argue that if Luther said that he believed that a good Christian Lord who did exactly what they were supposed to was about as rare as a thing on earth you could find, right? And so his argument was that he by the way makes a really interesting comment that he says, I would rather live under a good Muslim Lord than a bad Christian one, and there's a lot of bad Christian ones, but which is a pretty astonishing thing to say in the 16th century. I think Luther's argument would be that you have to kind of go to the local officials. You have to go to people that will listen. And there's going to be a lot of people that won't listen. They're going to just take care of themselves. So probably his argument would be, to try to make the argument that he's making in this case, that the public officials have this great responsibility. And if they don't, they're abdicating their Christian responsibility. He writes it in, obviously for a Christian context, for a Christian society. And so that may lose some of its force in our modern kind of secularized society. But I do think you have to appeal to the consciences of the local officials as best you can. Mike, you've been a good conscience that way, and you've used your kind of abilities to kind of raise this awareness, but it's frustrating, I think, isn't it? When we all, are keep raising this issue, it seems so obvious, right? It just seems so, the evidence we have is so right in front of us, and nothing's getting done. I don't know. I don't understand it.
So can I share my screen here for a second, just to show you? Let's see. Host disabled it. That's okay.
I think Eric can maybe make you host, or can I do it? Let me see. I'll see if I can make you co-host. Okay.
I just did it, Mike. Go ahead.
Okay.
Not Stephen.
Oh, yes. Give him time.
I see you, Fred.
Well, right.
There it is. But anyway, so here's Vermont. This is Vermont down here.
You're not sharing
yet.
yet.
Yet, Mike.
Are you not seeing it yet?
No.
Nope. Oh, let's see.
You got to click share twice.
Oh, you do? Okay.
It's all participants, so you
Yeah,
should.
okay, there it is. Now do you have it?
Okay.
Okay, so Vermont's 3.8. Here's Washington that had such a hard time. At their peak, they were at 12. And here's the United States average, 31.6. Here's Native Americans, 78.5. This is North Dakota. This is the stratosphere where the red category starts for imminent and active outbreak is 25.
Wow.
So we're 174.1. There's no state that's been anywhere near this. New York at its peak was 50, and now they're at 10. So it shows that you can make a difference. And to Roy's point, Brookings, South Dakota, September 1st, they issued a mask mandate, and they're half the cases as the rest of South Dakota. So it works. Okay, so we have all this data, but you're right. The data doesn't seem to make as big a difference, but I think our best chance is, and there are more cities that have done mask mandates. But man, I mean, every day, it went up 4 points again today, and the death total just keeps rising. So North Dakota's making this way worse than it needs to be. Okay, I'm done, sorry.
Yeah, very, very true.
I'm done. Sorry, I gotta give you your screen back.
No, that's
How do
all right.
I do that? Okay.
There was a
Something at
story.
the top that says stop share.
Okay. There it is. Thanks.
Well, it's 11:35, and if people want to, keep going, but we usually end around 11:30. So quick reminder, Roy is here next Sunday as well, and then the Sunday after, Aaron Folkerts will be here to talk about mental health as we approach the holidays in the time of pandemic. He's a pastor, a Lutheran pastor. He actually works for the Moorhead Police Department. I think he's still teaching at Moorhead State in their counseling department. So he's a PhD or ED in counseling, a doctorate in counseling. So should be a good one. So the next 2 Sundays, we've got some good stuff coming up. So, and then thank you to Roy for the very informative thing. One last thing that most people don't realize is that there was actually a big global cool down as well from the 1300s through the 1650 or something like that. And that may have contributed. There's some epidemiologists that I read that said that may have contributed to the spread of the plague because it does better in cooler weather. And then people are inside more and stuff like that. So.
Yeah, some scholars call it the mini ice age because there was a lot of crop failure and other issues. People were, ill because of their lack of health and other things that contributed. Yeah.
Yep.
Well, it's been a treat. You're great. You're just like my students at Concordia. A lot of fun to talk with and ask great questions. Next week, you can really put me on the spot like my students do. Whatever questions you have, bring them. I'll talk a little bit about Luther and the Jews. We talked pretty positively about Luther today, and I think he, has some interesting things to say. We'll kind of go wherever you want to go next week.
Thank you.
I want to say thanks, Roy, for the, and also that for those of us on the phones, it's come across just beautifully this morning. So thank you very much for setting it up.
If you have questions you think of, you can shoot them to me or Aaron or directly to Roy if you have his email address, and but otherwise bring them next Sunday. But thank you. Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're done.
Yeah, didn't you?
Go take care of your cacti, Jim Elgers.
And you can let people know that we recorded this and we'll put it up on YouTube as well.
Okay.
I saw the